Anyway, let's start. So today's stuff is torso, and well, remasked for abs, but one can't really draw abs without anything else. So we'll discuss a little bit how the abdominal muscle is made, but we can do it without, as you can see, without the bones that abs attach to. So it attaches to the sternum, to the rib cage, and it attaches to the pelvis. And because abs are actually, you can already see it here. It's huge muscle. It's not just, well, these rectangle shapes. It's actually more than that. We have the external oblique going here, allowing us to rotate the torso and do some exercises. Then we have this, and of course they change their form. For example, in the zone of pyramidalis muscle, it's more like cone shaped or pyramid shaped, and we'll discuss all that in detail, but we can discuss it without the rib cage. So as a sort of warm-up, I think we could start from drawing very simple shapes just in order to warm up, because I certainly didn't. And those who saw yesterday's stream probably remember me using this sort of ellipse to imply the neck projection point. So we're making an oval shape, and then this here signifies the end of the sternum. This is the 7th rib, and this is the ribs number 8 and 9, and the little 10th rib is there. So this here is a simplification of the rib cage, and then we have to create a sort of simplification of the pelvis. And what I found works the most is this sort of rectangular shape, right? Except we probably need it to be a little bit higher, yeah, because there's some twist going on in the form. And so here we have it. Wait a second. I had to Google some words because I know the names in my native language, so I constantly have to Google the terminology. So Google tells that this is called iliac spine, and this is probably like the part we will mention the most, because this is the part where a lot of muscle connects to. So this is a bit complicated. For the warm-up we'll return to this, but for now let's add some other shapes, and this time we'll make them even simpler in order to focus on the general movement. As you can see, I'm using a guideline here that creates a movement already. So for example, this shape could be a person that is doing some exercises. They made their left arm go up, their right arm go down, and we can already like guess what's going on with their pose from the axis of pelvis in relation to the axis of the chest, they already create movement. So why is it is important to draw the like simple shapes is to get the general movement from the simplest form possible, which is of course the point of gesture drawing and stuff, but it's also like useful to do it from imagination to get accustomed to the general shape language of the human figure, that language being spheres, cylinders and boxes. Like the pelvis here is more of a boxy shape, and our chest is more of a cylindrical shape with a touch of sphere. Of course, when we are talking about our chest and our ribcage, we will also need to have some simple faces. For example, we'll make this part, the front part, a little bit more flat than everything else, and then we'll show that this part is the side, and the two turns here, so we're having a form like this. And usually when we're drawing a figure, we apply a little bit of tone here to show that the form turned away, that this is no longer frontal part. Why is this important? Well, because when we draw, for example, pectoral pecs, pectoralis majoris it's called, had to Google it too. It kind of wraps around the form like this, so we have to imagine the surface of the ribcage and show the line that goes around that surface. So this is the simple warm-up part, where I wanted to just to discuss the two huge main shapes that everything else is attached to. Now, well, of course, obviously, when a subject like this turns up, you have to like study some people, and since we also discuss muscles, it's useful to study muscular people. So for the purpose of this lecture, I wanted to use an image of Ricardo Milos, but I couldn't find I couldn't find good enough quality, so we'll go with Arnold Schwarzenegger instead. So the first thing that we can notice here is that like he's really buff here, like really buff, but is he though? Let's find his ribcage. So this is the end of the sternum, the part where clavicles attached to. This is the sternum, it's clearly visible, and we can see its end. He has huge pecs, so the sternum is almost hidden behind the pecs. Now, you probably see this part. This is 7th rib, and we can see the ribcage surrounding the abs and creating like this side here. So we can already guess the position and the size of the ribcage. Here it is, right? It's not terribly big because generally bones don't grow that much. Obviously, bones, I heard, can become like thicker and stronger when subjected to pressure, but obviously, like you can't you can't have gains on the ribcage, right? So this is important because it creates a a sort of shape contrast, like we have this part that is thin because there's mostly bone here, and then we have the muscly part, the upper part of the body, and it's like huge because there's well, a lot of muscle there, which allow us to search for contrast, to search for the places where the bone comes close to the surface and where it's hidden. Because if we now go next, we can find his pelvis. And we can find the external obliques wrapping around the iliac crest, the iliac ridge. So there it is. Now, because he is ripped and he's also like not fat at all, we can see the sartorius muscle. And while we're not drawing legs today, but it's important to remember that the pelvis is useful not only for drawing torso but also for drawing legs, because the sartorius muscle goes from the iliac ridge, like here, and it divides leg into the muscles that engage the inner part of the thigh. There they are like this, and the quadricep. Here it is on the outside. So the general shape of the leg, which looks like this, right, is defined by the sartorius muscle, which in turn the position of we can infer by finding the pelvis. So finding pelvis and ribcage is pretty important, and most of the anatomy books start with that. And they start with those simplified skeletons like the ones I started with, and I always skip that part because I found it boring. But after some time learning, I realized that the boring part was pretty important because bones define the figure. So now let's talk about the abs. We can see this general shape. And when we're drawing our abs, it's important to know two things. The faces can be described like this. So we have side, front, side. Sometimes we have a dent here like this. Of course, I'm exaggerating the form. But this is the lower part. So we have pyramidalis here, and like everything is flat here. The upper part of course has this same structure, but it also has the upper part and lower part for the for the abs that go above. So it is necessary when drawing abs to first design the form of each ab to create an interesting shape, an interesting form, a flowing form. We will talk about it a little bit later when we start actually drawing, because right now I'm just dissecting the form. And second, to always find the faces. Right, this is pretty important. Which face of the form looks faces where. So yeah. And the upper part of the abs is wider than the lower part. So we have form like this. Now the ribs. Let's count them. So this here, pretty sure that is the 7th one. Here they are. 9, 10. Here they are. It is pretty useful to actually know how to count the ribs, because serratus, this muscle, is attached between the ribs from 1 to 8, and well, we can't do too many ribs, right? We need to know how many we can actually see, in every possible situation. So here's, for example, the 6, and we will return to this when we will start drawing our own drawing. Now for the upper part of the body, what we have here is huge pectoralis majoris, which is stretched out because he has his arms, and it has these types of structure. This is the part that is the most buff. This is the thin part of the pectoralis majoris. So I'm drawing a simple polygonal net to show how this form is made. Now it's important to remember that it's attached here, so we have a little strand of our pectoralis majoris going here below the deltoid, and then it's actually divided into two parts. The lower part of the pectoralis majoris is the one that we bench press with, and the upper part, like inclined bench press, is usually used to train this part. So here it's harder to see, but usually the upper part goes down and the lower part goes up. Where's the Arnie? Oh yeah. Now we have a little bit of deltoid, the frontal part of the deltoid, and here, hidden behind everything else, are clavicles, which we discussed yesterday, but we will of course return to them today. Now this big cobra-like shape behind is the latissimus dorsi, which is like one of the biggest muscles, pretty huge, and it's usually used when we pick something very heavy from the ground, or when we are doing deadlifts, and it defines the shape of both the back and the front view of the figure, so we have to make sure we find and show the latissimus dorsi. Of course, depending on the figure, it can be bigger and can be smaller, but even a small anime girl will have a little bit of bulge, indicating the location of the latissimus dorsi. Now let us start drawing a figure. We'll probably go with something similar to this Arnie pose that we are watching. Oh, by the way, I forgot to say this, but I advise you to follow along with these lectures, basically to draw when I draw, because some of the things I explained, they are not about bones and muscle, but about the ways to interpret the form. You can probably notice that my way of drawing is stylized, that I'm trying to rhyme my lines to find some sort of written flow to them, and this is the sort of thing that is that I don't explain much. I explain it by doing, so yeah. Now we will start with drawing our ribcage. Very simple shape, and we will maybe try to find some sort of movement here already, for example like this. Now finding the neck projection point, and I also have to imply a silhouette to like know what I intend to draw. So these lines are very sketchy, they are very imprecise, just something to remind myself of the general intent. Now we're placing the sternum, and in this drawing I usually don't do it for when I'm drawing myself, but we will have to like draw the rib cage, and we will even draw a little diagram, a little illustration to count the ribs. So here inside we'll talk a little bit about the ribs in the rib cage. So let's even stop for a second. Oh, yeah. So this is the rib cage. As you can see here, when I draw the neck projection point, right, it is largely identical to the first rib. It is the smallest, the flattest rib. Then we have these two. They're actually often visible on a person. We can see little dents here, a little bit of shade on people, not on Arnold, of course, like impossible to see anything behind the huge pecks, but on normal people we can see ribs number 2 and 3. Now, when we have the pectoralis majoris, it usually ends up somewhere around 5th ribs, and then we have these two guys taking out, and usually like we see maybe around this, like right as the tense is usually hidden, and not many, but it's important to be able to find them on the figure and show them. Now let's return to drawing, and actually let's show the end of the sternum. So the sternum itself consists of 3 parts. You can see them on the ribcage diagram, right? So we have this flat big part called manubrium that looks like the head of an insect. It's where clavicles attached to, and it can be seen on a person quite clearly. Then we have the main body, and then we have the xiphoid process, which is a small bit of rib. Sometimes it also can be seen if the person is sufficiently thin. Now, to the sides of the manubrium, the first rib attached, and to the upper parts, the clavicles attached. We'll create this simple schematic here, and in order to later, of course, I will erase it all later or hide it under the forms, but we kinda need those to be able to build on top of them and to be able to understand. Of course, when I'm drawing my own stuff, I don't necessarily draw every anatomical part, but for the purposes of understanding, it's pretty useful to have clavicles, manubrium, and sternum. Now let us add these lines to show the front of the rib cage. So after this, our form changes its direction. and we start seeing the side of the ribcage. This will be important for the purposes of shading or rendering the form. Now, because the shoulders are tilted a bit, let's do the same with the guidelines of the ribcage. And now I need to self-correct a little bit. So what we have here is the rib number 2, and then we have third, and by the way, there's a direction thing going on here that looks like this. The upper parts face upwards, the lower parts like look down. Also, the lower we go, the more often our ribs happen, right? So the gaps here are pretty big, and the gaps down are smaller and smaller. I will make them really sketchy, just in order to be able to rely on them when we're drawing. Also, 6 and 7s and 8s, they are all connected together. So ribs 1 to 7, these guys, are called true ribs, and everyone else is called false ribs, because ribs from 8 to 10, and the floating ribs as well, are not connected directly to the sternum. They're kind of faking it. So they're called false ribs. Also, this means that this part of the ribcage is the thickest. It usually creates something like a dent here on the silhouette, because this is the widest, the 7th rib is the widest one, supported by the sternum. Every rib lower doesn't have such a good support structure, so they're usually thin, like the diameter of the ribcage in those places is thinner, is smaller, and that influences the silhouette, which is important to us. By the way, you know, and everyone else, I'm recording this, so if you have hard time following, you will be able to watch the recording. I hope it will help. Now let's create a simple pelvic shape here. This is the general line, like the central line of symmetry. What I'm doing here is making the ribcage face a little bit there, and the pelvis to face more towards us. So this line moves, like basically he's directing his pelvis at us, but he's not looking at us with his ribcage. Now, at this point, we can attach the shoulders like these simple spheres. It usually helps to not do anything complicated in the beginning of the drawing. I will also deal with the symmetry. As you can see, there was a little bit of problem with the symmetry. Now that we discussed the main points, we can show the ribs that we will be drawing often more clearly. So this here is the 6th, this here is 7th. Let's move the 8th upwards so that we could include numbers 9 and 10, and make it a little smaller here. Of course, I then use these lines to project the ribs by using very simple projection of a point in perspective. I'm constantly talking about points, faces, like edges, because that's actually how we draw. Usually we're kinda this really cheap and not terribly precise 3D modeling software. So it's usually better to not go by your feeling, but instead use like geometry, project points, and use guidelines. By the way, since Juno said about microphone, how clear can you hear me? How bad it is, basically? Oof. Yes, headset would work very well, I think. Now, what I'm showing here is the fact that our false ribs face inside a little bit, and then we also have our spine in the back, but we will not discuss it today. But in general, we have to remind ourselves that this is 3D form and there's things in the back. I also found pretty useful for me to sculpt the anatomy. Some things can be easier understood when dealt with in 3D, but that's just a personal experience that I wanted to share. Now that we have most of our parts here, we can talk about muscles. So on this, let's create a new layer actually. Should I maybe wait then and instead detail the ribcage a little bit while you're catching up? Because I'm not sure what speed you guys have. or you could catch up in the recording. Yeah. Oh, you can follow. Okay, then let's continue. So this here we hit it a little bit, maybe too much, of course. Now the 7th rib we will have to return. Everything else is less important. So now let's add the pectoralis majoris and the shoulders. So the shoulders go here, connected to the clavicle and the scapula, like we discussed yesterday. Scapula is hidden on the back, but let's show it. Here it is, and in the middle between clavicle and scapula our shoulder bone goes in, and it's where a little strand of our pectoralis majoris would go, and also where the deltoid attaches itself. The frontal part of the deltoid and its middle part, which surrounds the clavicle. And now we can make these guideline, it's just a guideline, to create something like a section of our pecks. Now we can draw the bottom part like this. We'll make it more detailed later, but now we need to just wrap the pectoralis majoris on the rib cage. And do you remember the frontal parts that we were drawing? These parts, right? This is the frontal part and this is the side part. This is also the border on which we show this change in direction, right? These points here are where our pectoralis majoris starts to face away. It's also where we'll have our nipples. Our pecs divided into strands, and we can also show this change of direction. And our shoulders can also be imagined as a shape which is kind of boxy shape. It's a mix between a sphere and a box. Now we can return to our ribs, because it's pretty useful usually to show this thickness to the border of the rib cage of the 7th rib, because depending on the person, of course our abdominal muscles, they're attached on top of the rib cage, right? They go like this, but this part of the abdominal muscle is really thin compared to the part where actual abs begin, because it's it's closer to a tendon at that point, like it's thin tissue. And because of this, depending on the person, we can see actually quite a lot of bone structure on the upper part of the abs. Just something to keep in mind. Of course, while we're going at it, we're also going to redefine our silhouette a little bit. And while we're at it, why not attach the latissimus dorsi? So here it is, a huge shape. This part is thicker, this is, or not thicker, this part goes like this part goes like this. Kinda like a cobra snake. Now, in order to draw the abs, the side parts of the abs, we will use guidelines here that go from the ribcage, like here, so the form is wider on top and thinner here. Now this is, by coincidence, is also the part where we have our belly button. Here it is. And now we can try finding or creating the forms our individual abs. The general rule, the one at the top, they're usually pretty small, and also the amount actually can be variable. Usually it's a six-pack, yes, but not necessarily. So you can probably see that I'm already defining the planar structure. So where are the faces of the form and which side are they facing? So this is the inner face, the front face, the outer face, and this is the junk that I'm erasing. Now, the belly button is important because this is the part where our form becomes softer, and this means that at this point our abs are wider, and here to the side of the false ribs we have attached the external oblique, basically also an abdominal muscle that is doing its abdominal muscle stuff. So already we have this figure that is almost like a person, right? Now we can determine the ribs a little bit again, but this time on the surface, and ribs on the surface can be mainly seen as these bits of shade, but of course, since we are drawing an athlete, it also means that we'll see the serratus muscle between our ribs. Usually we see about 4 parts of the serratus. And the most important thing when drawing is to find the 7th rib, the border between true ribs and false ribs, the part where the abdominal muscle is attached. Basically, the 7th rib is doing a lot of form defining stuff, so it's usually useful to find, but I also prefer to find the ribs number 6, 5th if you can see it, and of course ribs number 8 and 9 are pretty important too. Now I drawn a curve, but I lied, I made a mistake. It actually looks like this because our ribs are attached together, and these connection points create a change in the direction of the surface. So we will have a more like traditional shape of the ribs, the shape that can be seen a lot in academic art of different ages. So what we have here is a pretty rough sketch that we can now modify. Now I will have to hide these ribs a little bit more, but we might use them later anyway. And now these parts can be shaded like this to show that the form is facing away. Now let us divide the pectoralis majoris a little bit into strands. And let's draw manubrium a little bit, because this part where the first rib goes and attaches to the manubrium and then the clavicles happen, this part can be found on a person as a little bit of bulge beneath the surface, which also has a planar structure. And of course the clavicles attachment. And now we can draw a little bit on our trapezoid. So the form here looks like this. We have muscle going from the ear here and attaching to the clavicle and to the manubrium, and a strand of this muscle goes sideways, attaching itself to the clavicle. But then here we have like a pit of earth, a little bit of empty space between the trapezoid muscle and this. Now let us define the abs a little bit, since some people are here for the abs. The simplification that I use the most is once again the structure consisting of 4 major planes. There they are. And one other thing that should be done at this point is that the lower part of the ribcage is usually facing away from the light source. So if we imagine our ribcage as an egg, this egg would be lighted from somewhere, and as a big volume it will have this general shading, right? So the same happens to the ribcage, and this means that our border between lighted areas and not so lighted areas and the shadow will be here. So the lower part of our abdominal muscles and the lower part of the ribcage will be shaded like this. But of course, we should remember that there have smaller shapes as well. So now we'll be defining the form of our abs a little bit. We have our first pair here, and this second pair will be longer. Also, it's important to remember that this person is stretched right now, at least I drew them stretched, and this means that our ab shape will be different, it will be asymmetrical, they won't be the same on the left and on the right. And at this point I have a lot of different junk in the drawing that remains from the sketch, and now I'll be cleaning up and rendering, speaking a little less, drawing a little bit more. And actually, let's enlarge this guy, he deserves bigger. Oh, I forgot his bones. So now mostly shading. Also I'm trying to get the contrast on the left side to be weaker, because the right side faces us and the left side faces away, so we need to have more tone on the right side, on the side that faces our viewer. Now let us also show that the lower part of the latissimus dorsi is shaded like this, and also I will make some lines thinner because they're a bit of a problem right now at this point. And this we can draw a little bit of shadow just for fun. Now let's show that our pectoralis majoris, it actually has thickness to it, right? So we have to show the part that faces below, so there, that looks down, and the part that faces sideways, to the sides, sorry. So we'll have something like this. Now I will apply the blend to make an illusion of soft surface. In this way, the muscle will have volume to it, and this is something we want. Now let us define the shoulder a little bit. As I said, it has its upper part here, the flat surface on the top, well, semi-flat, and then it has its front side, here it is, and well, the side on the side. I'll need to brush up on the language, certainly. And this little part, this is the point where the upper part of the pectoralis majoris is the thinnest, and the elbow, the deltoid hasn't started yet, so we have a little bit of dent on the surface here, and then we have this shape. By the way, I am considering to make these streams regular in the first parts of the week, so Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, maybe Thursday. And I'm also considering to make one day where I'm just giving feedback, so looking at the works and giving feedback in regards to the anatomy. So if you are interested, we'll make this a thing. Of course, I'm willing to exchange my services for the likes, subscribes, etc, etc. So we have here the frontal part of the deltoid and the side parts, and the back part is being hidden, but we can see a little bit here. And let's add the tricep here, because why not? We already have the bicep anyway. Now that we have an arm, we can return to drawing the pecs. In general, it's good to never stay in one part of the drawing for long. So constantly switching attention between the parts is usually a good way to work on drawing. Definitely will help you. Now let us define a clavicle. It's a shape like this, right? It has top side and front side, which means that it's not that to be shaded as such. Let's show the top side. But we can't draw too much on the front side because it's hidden by the skin, and maybe there's a lot, maybe there's little, it depends on the person, but yeah. Now manubrium also can be divided into planes, right? Here we have two sides and the front side. Now do you remember me talking about ribs number 2 and 3? We can show these little bits of shade here to imply the connection point of the ribs number 2 and 3. Now I'm just cleaning it a little bit. And again, the left pec also should be divided into the planes. So we're adding stuff like this here. We're adding the shading to show that it has its thick bottom side and that it has volume to it. So now our person already looks like a person. We have the general volume, we have most of the main muscle groups, and we even have one arm, but we can imply another here. There. By the way, if anyone has a high definition image of Ricardo Millis, where can when a torso can be seen and the abs as well, it'd be fun to make a little Millis drawing marathon, like to draw torso analysis sketches. So if anyone has it, yeah, it'd be silly. A silly little project to do. Combining memes and studies usually works well. Now we will be mostly defining the ribcage and the abs, because they're definitely not worked on enough. First I'll start by adding a little bit of light to the lighted side, so to the front side. And let's work on the abdominal muscles a little bit. Now this part we will smudge the connection a little bit to show that the abs are going above the ribs. So like this. And here I'm showing the upper part of the second set of abs. Now the upper part of the abs around the belly button is usually lighted, and depending on the amount of the body fat in the person, we will see another division. Because it's mostly just like the abs, just two long muscles divided by these tendon structures. So, of course, that means when the muscle is well defined, it creates separate volumes in forms of the six-pack. Now, let us add a little bit of light, for example here, and make the central symmetry line a little bit weaker, because it's starting to drain the viewer attention away from the more complex forms. And drawing is mostly a way to control and direct the attention, so we need to be careful with our contrasts. I'm also shading the lower part of the individual ab shapes and weakening this line. Now, because the ribs number 8, 9, etc. are attached to the 7s, we have this frame here, which can be even lighted a little bit, so something like this. But of course, those ribs themselves are covered with the external oblique, so the visibility of this frame decreases the lower we go. Now let us draw the other shapes. So external oblique goes here, and of course this is where we have our fermentalis, and this is also the part where we're having our pelvis peak a little bit. So at this point the pelvis started, here it is, and the moment we pass the pelvis, this part faces inside, so it's darkened. But of course this part isn't terribly well lit either. Now, when we are dealing with the external obliques, and the shape is really simple, it's important to remember that they go like this. This is the general direction of external obliques. And second, the volume like anything else, so we will have this side that goes away from us, let's darken it, and then it has the downside, like the bottom side, here it is. So the question of how do I shade muscle that Rim asked previously is answered as always, that muscles should be analyzed and divided into simple shapes, and the simple shapes should be shaded like the simple shapes they are, like boxes and cylinders and spheres. This shows the structure of the shoulder. Again, as always, we have the upper face, the frontal face, and the side. Again, we made a simplified shape out of it. So here it is. Now let us decrease the contrast on the side a little bit. And increase the contrast in these points. And of course increase the contrast here and here. When we are drawing the belly button, there's a little bit of fold here, and we have to create a good shape for the fold, a good design. Like anything else, belly button should be designed. And we might have this little dent here and the side here. Now let's clean the clavicle up a little bit, show this volume here, and continue cleaning up the foam. It's also good to have thinner lines on the far side of the drawing and thicker lines on the near side of the drawing. Usually works well. So there it is. I think the general structure can be seen here. We have the iliac ridge here. We have the pelvis. We have the rib cage. Basically, we have all we wanted. We also have abs, etc. So now let's just enlarge it, clear up the junk, and finish it. So yeah, that's it. I hope you had a good time, or you found something interesting or useful to you. Yeah. So thank you all for watching. And if you are watching this on YouTube for some reason, then please don't forget to like and subscribe and comment and stuff. So yeah, thanks to everyone and bye.